She wasn't looking for anything that morning, just the silence, the cold air, and the open land that reminded her she was still alive. But the horse had other ideas. He stopped at the edge of the dry creek bed and refused to move, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring at something she couldn't see. And that's when she heard it. A low, broken sound rising from the brush below. Not wind, not an animal, a man's voice. Barely. Don't let her find it, please. Before we get into this story, I have to ask you something, because it matters. If a dying man's last words led you to a secret buried under your own town's soil, would you dig it up, or would you leave it alone? That's exactly the choice this widow had to make. And what she found didn't just change her life. It unraveled 40 years of lies that an entire town had agreed, silently, to keep. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a like. And tell me in the comments what city or town you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the morning the horse wouldn't move. The town of Harrell's Crossing sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines in eastern Montana, the kind of place that looked painted from a distance and forgotten up close. Population, 412, depending on the season. In winter, it shrank. In summer, it breathed a little. But it never really changed. Zara Cutfield had lived there for 22 years, first as a young bride, then as a rancher's wife, and for the last 3 years, as a widow. Her husband, Del, had died of a heart attack in the barn on a Tuesday morning, mid-task, his hand still wrapped around a fence post driver. She found him at noon when lunch went unanswered. That was the kind of death Del would have wanted, she told herself. Working, quiet, no fuss. She was 51 years old, lean and weathered in the way that outdoor living carves into a person. With gray threading through dark hair, she kept braided. She didn't ask for help and rarely received it. The ranch, 240 acres of grass, rock, and stubborn creek water, was hers now, along with 4 horses, 11 head of cattle, and a border collie named Patch who had decided, somewhere along the way, that Zara was the only person worth following. The horse that refused to move that morning was named Covenant. He had come to her in a strange way, 3 years before Del died, found wandering the east fence line with no brand, no saddle, no sign of where he'd been or who he belonged to. Del had wanted to report him to the county. Zara had looked into the animal's eyes and said, quietly, he stays. Del hadn't argued. He'd learned, over 20 years of marriage, which decisions were already made. Covenant was a dark bay, almost black, with a white mark on his forehead that curved like a crescent. He was calm in ways that other horses weren't, steady in storms, unbothered by machinery, gentle with strangers. The vet, a practical woman named Dr. Bren, had estimated him at around 12 years old and declared him healthy and unregistered. No one in Harrell's Crossing recognized him. No flyers ever matched his description. He simply was, as if the land had placed him at the fence line and waited for Zara to find him. She rode him most mornings, an hour before the day's work began. It was her private time, the one ritual that remained unchanged since Del's death. She'd saddle him in the dark, walk him out to the east pasture, and they'd move together through the early light without much direction. Covenant seemed to choose the path as often as she did. On the morning that changed everything, it was the second week of October. The grass had gone gold and brittle. The sky was the pale, colorless white of early winter trying to arrive early. Zara had slept poorly. She often did. And she'd gone out before 5, before full light, needing to move. They followed the creek bed south, which was unusual. Covenant typically drifted north or east toward the open pasture. But that morning he turned south without prompting, and Zara let him go. She trusted the horse in the way she'd learned to trust very few things. Not blindly, but on evidence accumulated slowly over years. The south end of her property met a ridge of sandstone and scrub juniper, and beyond it, through a gap in the fence that Del had always meant to repair, lay a stretch of BLM land, federal land, technically, but practically unused. No trails, no cattle, just rock and brush and the occasional coyote. Covenant stopped at the top of the dry creek bed where it dropped about 8 feet into a shallow basin, and he would not go further. Zara clicked her tongue. He didn't move. She applied gentle pressure with her heels. He stood like stone. She leaned forward and looked down into the basin below. At first she saw only brush and shadow. Then she saw the shape. A man, lying on his side against the bank, half hidden under the overhang of sandstone. One boot off, A dark coat, a hand stretched out in front of him, palm up, like he was asking the dirt for something. "Hey," she called. "Hey, can you hear me?" The silence lasted long enough that she thought he was dead. Then the voice came, thin as paper, barely above a whisper. Don't let her find it, please." Zara was off covenant before she'd fully decided to move. She tied him to a juniper branch. He wouldn't wander, but habit was habit, and picked her way down the loose sandstone slope into the basin below. The man was old, 70, maybe older. Hard to say with certainty because his face was weather-damaged in the extreme, the skin pulled tight over sharp bones, deeply lined. White stubble across his jaw. His coat was canvas and heavy, the kind ranchers wore in the 60s and 70s, and it was torn at the shoulder. His one bare foot was blue with cold. She crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse, weak, but present. "Sir, I'm going to get help. Can you tell me your name?" His eyes opened partially. Pale gray eyes, almost silver, filmed with something. Pain, or something older than pain. "Tolan," he said. The word took effort. "Tolan. Okay. I'm Zara. You're on my property, the Cutfield Ranch. You need medical attention. I'm going to call for help." "No." His hand moved, found her wrist with surprising strength for a man lying in a ditch. "No hospitals. You're hypothermic and you may be injured. I can see blood. Listen." His grip tightened, the gray eyes sharpened. Whatever was behind them was still very much present, even if his body was failing. "Listen to me. What I told you, don't let her find it. You understand? Don't let." He broke into coughing. Wet. Deep. Bad. "I'm calling," she said firmly. "You can explain everything else later." She pulled her cell phone from her jacket. 1 bar. She walked up the slope 3 steps and had 2. She called Harrell's Crossings Volunteer Fire Station and gave coordinates as best she could. The south end of the Cutfield Ranch, the dry creek basin below the sandstone ridge. She was told 20 minutes, minimum. She went back down to Tolan. She pulled her own jacket and covered his bare foot with it, then arranged him as best she could without knowing what injuries he might have. She'd taken a wilderness first aid course years ago, mostly forgotten, and she pulled up the fragments she could. "Don't move him. Keep him warm. Keep him talking. How did you get here, Tolan?" A pause so long she thought he'd lost consciousness. Then, walked. "From where?" "Road." The nearest road was 2 miles south. "You walked 2 miles and ended up in this creek bed?" "Didn't mean to." A sound that might have been a short laugh. "Meant to get further." "Further where?" He didn't answer that. Instead, his eyes moved past her, up toward the ridge, and Covenant, who stood looking down at them both with absolute stillness. Something crossed the old man's face when he saw the horse. Not fear. Something closer to awe. Or recognition. "What is that animal?" he said. "His name is Covenant. He's mine." Tolan's cracked lips moved without sound for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Of course it is. Do you know him?" He closed his eyes. "I knew one like him. Long time ago." Zara waited. He spoke again without prompting, as if the presence of the horse had loosened something inside him. "I came here to put something right," he said. "Before I go. Should have done it years ago. Decades ago. I was a coward." Another pause. His breathing was labored. "There are people in this town who know what I did. One of them, at least, is still alive. And she's been carrying it with her every day since 1983. What happened in 1983? He opened his eyes and looked at her directly. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. "A boy died," he said, "and we buried the truth with him." The sound of a distant siren, still far off, threading through the valley, reached them both. Tolan closed his eyes again, and his grip on the world seemed to loosen fractionally. "Don't let her find it before you do," he said. "Whatever happens to me, promise me. I don't even know what it is." "My left boot," he said. "Before they take me." Zara looked around. The bare foot was the left. The boot was gone. She scanned the basin, walked its edges, found it 6 feet away against a rock shelf, apparently pulled off and hidden deliberately, or perhaps fallen during some earlier struggle with the sandstone. She picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. She reached inside. Folded papers. A bundle, held with a rubber band so old it crumbled when she touched it. Beneath the papers, small and cold, a key, brass, no label. She tucked them into her shirt pocket, inside her flannel, against her skin. She didn't know why she moved with that kind of instinct, as if she'd been waiting for this, as if the morning had been organized around this exact moment. Covenant, on the ridge above, made a low sound in his chest. Not a whinny. Something deeper. Something she couldn't name. The ambulance crew, two EMTs named Otis and Fran, arrived 18 minutes later and descended into the basin with professional calm. Tolan was barely conscious by then, but breathing steadily. They stabilized him, managed the slope with a litter, and had him in the vehicle within 12 minutes. Zara followed in her truck to Kellner County Medical Center, 40 minutes south on the highway. She didn't know why exactly. The man was a stranger, but she'd made a half promise in a creek bed, and she wasn't the kind of woman who let those dissolve in the daylight. At the hospital, they told her he was being treated for severe hypothermia, a hairline fracture in his left arm, probably from a fall, and what appeared to be advanced stage cardiac disease. He had no identification on him. None. No wallet, no cards, no phone. His coat had one interior pocket and it was empty. The admitting nurse, a tired, efficient woman named Vera Jo, looked at Zara with the particular expression of someone who has absorbed too many strange situations to be truly surprised by them anymore. You found him on your land. Yes. Know who he is. He said his name was Tolan. Vera Jo typed it in without optimism. Last name, he didn't say. Vera Jo entered Tolan, unknown, and moved on. Zara sat in the waiting room for 2 hours. She took the papers from her shirt pocket and smoothed them against her thigh. The bundle was 4 sheets, 2 handwritten, 1 typed, one that appeared to be a map, hand-drawn, with compass markings and distances in feet. The handwriting on the written sheets was cramped and old, the ink faded to brown. The paper was brittle and thinned at the folds. She read carefully. The first handwritten sheet was a kind of confession. It was written in first person but unsigned, a deliberate absence, she understood. The writer described an incident in the summer of 1983 involving a young man named Koi Jarnell, 19 years old, a ranch hand working on the Plymer operation north of Harold's Crossing. According to the letter, Koi had discovered something on the Plymer property, something buried. The writer said that wasn't meant to be found. There had been a confrontation, 3 men present, the writer, and 2 others identified only by initials, RH and GW. The letter did not describe exactly what happened next. It said only, Koi did not survive the night, and we agreed to say nothing. What we buried that night was more than a secret. It was a life we had no right to take. The second handwritten sheet was a list of names, 7 of them, with dates beside each name and short notations. Zara scanned them. 4 of the names she didn't recognize. 2 were clearly dead. The notation read gone with a year. The 7th name stopped her cold. Mina Plymer, still in Harold's Crossing. She knows. Zara sat very still for a long moment. She knew Mina Plymer. Everyone in Harold's Crossing knew Mina Plymer. She was 81 years old, shrunken and sharp-eyed, and she lived alone in the house where she'd been born. The original Plymer homestead on the north edge of town, the big Victorian with the wraparound porch and the garden that people drove past just to look at in summer. She'd outlived 2 husbands, never had children, and was known for her precise memory, her excellent lemon cake, and a silence about herself that the town had long since agreed to respect. She was also known for one other thing, which Zara had never thought about until this moment. She never went near horses. In a ranching town, that was unusual enough to notice. People had assumed it was a phobia. A bad fall, maybe. Nobody had ever asked. The typed sheet was more official looking. A property survey, partial, of the northwest corner of what had once been the Plymer operation. Certain coordinates were circled in pencil. The date on the survey was 1981, 2 years before the incident described in the letter. The hand-drawn map was keyed to the survey. X marked a location, near an old well house, by the look of it, on the edge of the property. Written beside the X, in smaller letters than the rest, what was taken is here. What is owed is below. Zara looked at the key. She drove back to Harold's Crossing in the early afternoon, the October light going amber and sideways across the valley. Her mind was working in the careful, methodical way it always did when something required seriousness. Not fast, not emotional, but steady and thorough. She had 3 immediate questions. Who was Tolan, really? What had Koi Jarnell discovered on the Plymer property? And what did Mina Plymer know? She added a 4th question as she pulled into town. Who was the her that Tolan had been so desperate to keep from finding whatever was buried at that X? RH and GW, the initials from the letter. She turned them over. GW could be half a dozen people. But RH, in Harold's Crossing, in the early 80s, working the Plymer operation, that narrowed considerably. She thought of old families. Old operations. Ranch hands and neighbors who would have been young men in 1983. She stopped at the filling station on Main and went inside. The owner, a man named Dewson, one of those people who belong to a town like a piece of furniture belongs to a room, was behind the counter reading a catalog. "Dewson," she said, not wasting time. "You grew up here. Born and raised." He looked up, reading her expression. "Something wrong. Do you remember a ranch hand named Koi Jarnell? Working the Plymer place around 1983? Dewson's face changed. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for drama. But something moved behind his eyes, a shift like a fault line settling. He set the catalog down slowly. "That's a name I haven't heard in about 40 years, he said. "What happened to him?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell her the pause was deliberate. "He left town. That's what people said. Moved on. Young men did that. Did you believe it?" Another pause. "What's this about, Zara?" "I found a man this morning on my south property line. Elderly. Critically ill. He says his name is Tolan and he's carrying documents about something that happened in the summer of 1983 involving Koi Jarnell and the Plymer operation." Dewson was very still. "He's at Kellner County Medical right now," she continued. "He had no identification. He told me not to let someone find what he was carrying before I did. I need to understand what I'm holding." "Zara," Dewson's voice dropped. "There are people in this town who would very much prefer that whatever you're holding stayed buried. Then they should have buried it better." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he came around the counter and flipped the door sign to closed. "Koi Jarnell was not a drifter," he said. "He was a serious young man. Smart. He'd come out from Nebraska. Family was gone. No money. Looking for work. He hired on at the Plymer Ranch in the spring of '83. By June, he'd found something in the northwest corner of the property, out near the old well house." Dewson paused. He'd been digging, doing some kind of irrigation work, old project. He found a strongbox. What was in it? No one knows. No one except the people who were there that night. Dewson's jaw tightened. What people do know is that Koi came into town the following week, asked around about legal counsel, said he'd found evidence of something serious and he wasn't sure who to trust. He was nervous. Jumpy. 3 days later, the Plymer Ranch reported him as a no-show. Said he'd packed his things and gone. And people accepted that. It was a different time. And the Plymer name carried weight. Still does, in some quarters. Dewson looked at her directly. "Mina Plymer was not involved in whatever happened. I've always believed that. She was young then, maybe 30, 31, and she married into that name, not born to it. Her first husband, Roland Plymer, was a different matter entirely. He's been dead since 1991. RH, Zara said quietly. "What? Nothing. What about GW?" Dewson hesitated. Then, very carefully, "Garth Wicks. He left Harrell's Crossing in 1985. Died somewhere in Arizona. I heard, 15 years back. So of the 3 men who were there that night, Tolan, Roland Plymer, and Garth Wicks. Tolan is the only one still living. If what you're telling me is accurate." Dewson folded his arms. "And if Tolan is who I think he might be, who do you think he might be?" "There was a third hand at the Plymer place that summer. Quiet man. Kept to himself. People called him by a nickname, something from his last name. I remember now." Dewson looked at the window. His full name was Nathaniel Stole, but everyone called him Nat. She thought of the old man in the creek bed. Pale gray eyes. "I came here to put something right. He came back," she said. "After 40 years. Dewson shook his head slowly. "He came back." Zara drove north through town toward the Plymer house with no particular plan beyond looking. She wasn't going to knock on Mina's door. Not yet. Not without understanding more. But she wanted to see the property, orient herself to the map, understand the geography of what she was dealing with. The Plymer homestead was set back from the road behind a line of old cottonwoods that had been there since before the house was built. The Victorian itself was well-maintained but quiet. Shutters closed on the upper story, garden put to bed for winter, the porch furniture moved inside. Mina's small green car sat in the drive. Zara drove slowly past without stopping. The northwest corner of the property, now much smaller than it would have been in 1983 because Mina had sold off parcels over the years, was visible from the road. The old well house was still standing, a low stone structure about the size of a garden shed, barely visible through the bare cottonwoods. Its roof had partially collapsed. It looked undisturbed. She drove around to the county road that ran along the north edge of the property and parked where the fence line met a cattle gate. She took the hand-drawn map from her pocket and oriented it. The X was approximately 60 feet from the well house, on a bearing that put it just inside the property line, close to the fence, close to the road she was sitting on. The ground here was undisturbed, native grass, dormant and pale. A few decades of weather and root growth would have erased any surface evidence of digging. She sat in the truck for a long time. What was taken is here. What is owed is below. Whatever Koi Jarnell had found in that strongbox, and Nat Stole had apparently taken, was somewhere near this fence. And what was owed, Stole's confession, perhaps, or some form of restitution, was buried beneath. Her phone rang. The number was the county hospital. "This is Zara Cutfield. Miss Cutfield." A man's voice measured. "My name is Dr. Anson. I'm treating the patient you brought in. Mr. Tolan. He's stabilized, but I want you to understand that his cardiac condition is serious. He's asking for you. I'll come. He's also asked, very specifically, that we not contact law enforcement. We're not obligated to honor that request, but I wanted you to know he made it." "Did he say why?" "He said, and I'm reading from the nurse's notes here, not yet. She needs to get there first." Zara looked out through the windshield at the pale sky above the Plymer property. "I'm on my way," she said. She was halfway to her truck when she heard a door. The sound came from the Plymer house. The front door, she thought, though she couldn't see it clearly through the trees. She heard footsteps on the porch. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the cottonwoods, moving toward the gate. Mina Plymer, small, compact, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, white hair beneath a knit cap. She was walking with purpose, not toward the house, but toward the fence, toward the northwest corner. She hadn't seen Zara. Zara's hands went still at her sides. "Don't let her find it." "Mina," she called. The old woman stopped. She turned slowly. When she saw Zara, something moved across her face, surprise, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "Zara Cutfield," she said. "Good afternoon, Mina." A silence that had its own texture. "What are you doing on this road?" Mina asked. Her voice was controlled, exactly as controlled as Deucen's had been. "I found someone this morning," Zara said. "On my property. He's at Kellner County Medical now. He's quite ill. His name is Nat Stole." Every bit of color left Mina Plymer's face. "He told me not to let you find it first," Zara said. "Whatever it is. He wanted me to read it first. Understand it first." She paused. "I think I do understand it. Or most of it." Mina stood absolutely still for 10 seconds. Then she walked to the gate and stopped with her hands on the top rail, looking at Zara across it. "He's alive," she said. Not a question. Almost a statement of something impossible. "Verily," Zara said. "He's asking for me. He should be asking for me." Mina's voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. She pressed her lips together. "I've been waiting 41 years for someone to come back and tell me the truth about what happened to Koi." Zara looked at her. "You knew him?" "He was—" Mina stopped. The old woman looked away, toward the bare cottonwoods, toward the cold light. When she looked back, her eyes were wet, but her expression was absolutely firm. "He was the person I loved most in the world," she said. "And my husband told me he left. And I knew, I always knew, that he didn't." They went to Kellner County Medical together. Zara drove. Mina sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still, staring at the road ahead with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a moment so many times that when it finally arrives it feels both familiar and entirely beyond preparation. They didn't speak during the 40-minute drive. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. At the hospital, Vera Jo looked at Mina with open curiosity and said nothing. Dr. Anson met them at the entrance to the cardiac ward. A careful man, early 50s, who had clearly already decided that whatever was happening here was above his pay grade in every sense that mattered. "He's awake," Anson said. "He's lucid. He's weak." He paused. "He told me he needs to say something to 2 women. He described you both accurately without knowing your names." Mina absorbed that without expression. Nat Stole's room was small and plain, the October afternoon pressing flat light through the single window. He was elevated against pillows and 4 in his arm, a monitor tracking his heart in steady lines. He looked smaller than he had in the creak bed, diminished by the white sheets and the clinical quiet. But his eyes were the same, sharp, present, carrying something enormous. When Mina walked through the door, he made a sound that was not quite a word, something broken loose from deep inside him. "Mina," he said. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked to the chair beside his bed and sat down with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something fragile. She did not take his hand. She looked at him. "Tell me," she said. He told them. It took almost an hour, with pauses for breath and for the weight of certain sentences to settle. His voice was weak but consistent, and he did not look away from Mina's face for most of it, as if he owed her, at minimum, that much honesty. In the spring of 1983, Koi Jarnell had been digging a new irrigation line in the northwest corner of the Plymer property when his shovel struck a metal box 18 inches below the surface. He'd opened it and found documents, financial records, handwritten ledgers, and a series of signed contracts. The records showed that Roland Plymer had been running a fraudulent land scheme for nearly a decade, falsifying survey documents to claim mineral rights on neighboring properties, selling those fabricated rights to investors in Billings and Great Falls, and pocketing the money. The scheme had defrauded at least 11 families of a combined sum that Nat estimated, even from what Koi had described, at close to $200,000. In 1983 terms, a devastating amount. Koi had brought the box to Nat, whom he trusted. He'd said he wanted to do the right thing, report it, return the money if it could be traced, give the family some justice. Nat had told Roland. He said this with his eyes closed, the flat statement of a man delivering the worst thing he'd ever done. Roland had come to the well house that night with Garth Wicks. There had been a confrontation. Koi had refused to hand over the box. Garth had. Nat stopped, swallowed, continued. Garth had struck Koi with a length of iron pipe. Roland had stood and watched. Nat had stood and watched. Both of them too frightened, too calculating, too cowardly to intervene. By the time they understood what had happened, Koi was dead. They buried him that night. Northwest corner of the property, near the fence, near the well house. 60 feet, on a bearing that put him just inside the property line. Below the strongbox, which they reburied above him. What was taken is here. What is owed is below. The strongbox had been placed over Koi's grave as a kind of marker, the only one any of them could make without exposing themselves. Nat had kept a duplicate of the financial records, which he'd taken before Roland could destroy them. He'd carried those records across 41 years and 11 states, never quite finding the moment, never quite finding the courage. "I should have come back the same year," he said. His voice was almost nothing now. "The same month. I should have walked into the sheriff's office. I should have," he stopped. "Yes," Mina said. "You should have." The two words were not cruel. They were simply accurate. She delivered them without flinching, and he received them the same way. "Koi told me he loved you," Nat said. "The night before. He was going to ask you to leave with him. Leave Roland. He'd found that box, and he said it was going to change everything. He was going to give you a way out." Mina sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a cloud moved across the pale sun, and the room dimmed slightly. "I knew he was going to ask me," she said. "I was going to say yes." Nat closed his eyes. Zara, who had been sitting in the second chair against the wall, listening without moving, now leaned forward. "Nat," she said, "the documents, the financial records, are they still usable?" He opened his eyes. "They're in my pack. Left it at a motel outside of Kellner, the Rimrock, off the highway. Room 7. Keys on the table by the door." He paused. "I couldn't carry everything." "The families Roland defrauded," Zara said. "Are any of them still living? Or their children?" "Some. I looked. Before I came." His voice was failing now, thinning at the edges. "That was the other reason I came back. Not just to confess. To give those records to someone who would know what to do with them." He looked at Zara. "I watched you a little," he said. "Before I fell. I'd been on your property for a day, maybe more. I saw you with that horse. I saw how you managed things. Alone." He paused. "You're the right person. You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But Covenant does." The monitor above him continued its steady marking of time. "How did you know that horse?" she asked. Nat Stole smiled, genuinely, for the first time. It changed his face entirely. "His mother was born on the Plymer Ranch," he said. "Spring of 1983. Beautiful animal. Koi named her." A pause. "He named her Promise." The days that followed moved the way significant things tend to move, both faster and slower than expected, and with a strange combination of practicality and grief. Zara drove to the Rimrock Motel the following morning and retrieved Nat Stole's pack. Inside, she found the financial records, fragile but legible, organized with a care that spoke of decades of guilty preservation. She also found a handwritten list of names and addresses. The families Roland Plymer had defrauded, traced across 4 decades, with notes on which heirs were still living. She called Deucin. Then she called the county sheriff's office in Kellner. Then, on the sheriff's recommendation, she called a retired attorney who'd spent 20 years handling land fraud cases. The attorney's name was Pell Osgood, and he drove up from Kellner the same afternoon. He spread Nat's documents across Zara's kitchen table, examined them in silence for 45 minutes, and then looked up with the expression of someone who has just found something they weren't certain still existed. "These are remarkably preserved," he said. "He took care of them," Zara said. Pell looked at her carefully. "This is going to be complicated. There are statutes of limitations, jurisdictional questions, the condition of the original records, but the underlying evidence is credible. If the heirs want to pursue civil claims, I think there's a real case to be made." He paused. "And there's the matter of Koi Jarnell." "Yes," Zara said. "That's a criminal matter. 41 years old, but there's no statute of limitations on murder in Montana." The investigation began within the week, with Nat Stole's testimony, given from a hospital bed to a county detective who listened without speaking for an hour and a half, and the physical evidence provided by the documents and the map. The sheriff's department applied for an excavation warrant. Mina Plymer signed a consent form for the excavation of her property without hesitation. The excavation took 2 days. On the morning of the second day, the remains of Koi Jarnell were recovered from the northwest corner of the Plymer homestead, 62 feet from the well house, 18 inches below the surface of the strongbox. The strongbox itself, corroded but intact, was lifted out above him. Its contents matched the duplicate records Nat had kept. Zara was not present at the excavation. She learned of it from a phone call. She sat on her porch afterward with Covenant beside her. She'd left the pasture gate open and he'd come up to the house on his own, which he sometimes did, and she put her hand on his neck and breathed. Koi Jarnell had been 19 years old. He'd loved a woman who'd waited 41 years to know the truth about what happened to him. He'd tried to do the right thing at the worst possible moment, surrounded by the wrong people, and it had cost him his life. She thought about that for a long time. Nat Stole died 14 days after Zara found him in the creek bed. His heart gave out in the early morning, peacefully, in the same hospital bed where he'd said everything he'd spent 4 decades trying to say. Dr. Anson told Zara there had been no distress, just an ending. She'd visited him twice more in those 2 weeks. The second visit had been the longest. She'd brought him photographs of the land, of Covenant, of the autumn light on the valley, because he'd asked her what the ranch looked like. He'd never actually seen it in full light. He'd arrived in darkness and left it on a stretcher. He looked at the photographs for a long time. "It's good land," he said. "It is," she agreed. He died without any family to notify. There was no one, as far as anyone could determine. Zara arranged a simple burial in Harrell's Crossings Public Cemetery. The stone was plain. It said, "Nathaniel Stole." He came back. Mina attended. So did Dewson. So did Pell Osgood, who had by then made contact with 7 of the 11 families affected by Roland Plymer's fraudulent scheme. Civil proceedings were underway. It would take time, years, probably, but the families were being heard. Mina had Koi Jarnell's remains interred in the same cemetery, in a plot she purchased and paid for herself. She chose his headstone with the same precision she gave to everything, and she had only 3 words carved beneath his name and dates. He was ready, she told Zara, on a cold afternoon when they'd taken to meeting for coffee on a semi-regular basis. Neither of them had quite decided this was friendship, but neither had decided otherwise, that those 3 words were the last thing Koi had ever said to her. In passing, casually, the morning of the day he died, when he'd been leaving the kitchen after breakfast, and she'd asked him how he was doing. Ready for what? She'd asked him. He'd smiled. Everything, he'd said. For the first time in 41 years, Mina allowed herself to believe he had meant it. The strongbox, cleaned and cataloged by the sheriff's office, eventually made its way, its contents documented and entered as evidence, to permanent archive. But the box itself was returned to Mina, at her request, when the investigation's evidentiary phase concluded. She put it on the mantelpiece in her living room, beside a photograph of herself at 30, young, serious, standing in a field in summer light. Zara asked her once why she'd kept it there. "Because it's his," Mina said simply. "He found it. He should get to keep it." As for Covenant, the dark bay with the white crescent on his forehead, the horse who had refused to move at the edge of a creek bed on a cold October morning, he continued his daily rounds of the Cutfield ranch with the serene indifference of an animal for whom the rightness of things is simply a given. Zara sometimes thought about what Nat had told her. That Covenant's mother had been born on the Plymer ranch. That Koi Jarnell had named her Promise. She didn't know how Covenant had come to be wandering her fence line 3 years ago with no brand and no history. She didn't know whose hands he'd passed through between the Plymer ranch and the dry autumn morning she'd found him. The vet had found no answers. The county records offered none. But she thought about the name his mother had been given, and she thought about what Covenant meant as a word, an agreement, a bond, a pledge between parties to hold something sacred. And she thought about how he'd turned south that morning, deliberately, without prompting, straight to the creek bed, straight to the man who carried the last piece of something owed. She didn't try to explain it. Some things resist explanation. They simply are, like the horse had simply appeared at the fence line, fully present, waiting to be met. She rode him every morning still, through the cold and the wind and the changing of the land. And she let him choose the direction. And wherever he turned, she followed. There's something this story keeps returning me to, long after I've finished telling it. The idea that truth has a kind of weight that can't be carried forever. Nat Stole carried it for 41 years. Across states, across decades, through every version of a life he might have had if he'd found the courage 20 years sooner. And in the end, it wasn't courage that brought him back. It was simply the fact that the weight had become greater than the fear. That happens to people. It happens more than we admit. And Mina Plymer, a woman who spent 4 decades tending a garden, living quietly inside a silence she'd never chosen, finally received what she was owed. Not justice exactly. Not repair. You can't repair 41 years. But truth. And truth, it turns out, is what grief needs most, even when it arrives late. Even when it arrives from a stranger dying in a creek bed. The horse named Covenant turned south that morning. Zara followed. And because she did, the right things happened. Imperfectly, incompletely, but really. Which is the only way right things ever happen. I think about the names on that hand-drawn map. What was taken is here. What is owed is below. Nat Stole wrote those words knowing that someone, eventually, would have to dig. He just didn't know who. He hoped it would be someone steady. Someone who would carry it properly. He found the right person. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of something buried in your own life, some truth that's gotten too heavy to carry alone, leave a comment below. I read every one. Give this video a like if you believe that returning to set things right, even late, even imperfectly, still matters. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Quiet places, hard truths, and the unexpected ways grace arrives. I'll see you in the next one.